Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 297. We're going to talk about the $1 billion Congress, something we just went over in our eighth grade history class. And we're just going to make some slight, small comparisons between Trump and Cleveland. Um, it was a long day, so I just kind of slapped this episode together pretty quickly. I'm just going to go through it really quickly. Midterm grades were due today, and so that took me a while. But anyway, Grover Cleveland was a Democrat, and who was president in two non-consecutive terms. So until Donald Trump pulled it off this past November, he was the only president to have to serve two terms as president, and they're being non-consecutive. And so Donald Trump is the second president to have non-consecutive terms. Now, Grover Cleveland was a while ago. His two terms were in 1884 and 1892, but there's some other similarities, like number one, well, there were similarities and lots of differences, okay, but he was president during the Gilded Age, the so-called Gilded Age. That is, it looks like a lot of prosperity, but underneath the shiny stuff is a lot of base metals or, inferior materials. So it only looks like it's solid gold, but it's not really. But that is simply the perception of Mark Twain. He wrote Gilded Age, I believe. And so that's the image that the impression he wanted to convey. But in reality, it wasn't really gilded. It really was a time of prosperity that had problems and issues, right? And unfortunately, because the literature and mentality started turning more politicized. In other words, the virtue signaling started uh, to take off around this time. And so, therefore, this is why a lot of issues started around the time of Grover Cleveland and has ballooned and mushroomed into the massive issues that we have today that Donald Trump is now tasked and is trying to resolve. So inflation was a big issue in 1884 when Cleveland was first elected. And the issue was that because of gold-backed currency, it was difficult for people to make money, right? And so there were high tariffs, which meant that import goods couldn't come in, and so people kept, and so there was a lot of protectionism here in the United States. So certain jobs and occupations which should have either streamlined or just gone away, they tried to survive, and this created a problem, right? And so it was mostly the farmers in the West and Southerners in the post-Civil War South. They wanted inflation. And the inflation at the time was going to be caused by inflating by using paper currency and silver as opposed to using gold. So the people who did not want inflation wanted to maintain and use only the gold standard. But the people who wanted inflation, they were going to have inflation by using silver. And silver was supposed to be 16 ounces to 1 ounce of gold. That was supposed to be the how you valued one against the other. But the problem was there was a sudden glut of silver. They discovered a couple new mines of silver, and so the silver price went down. And so people realized that they had this sort of arbitrage thing where they would take their 16 ounces of silver and get an ounce of gold, when in reality the true value was probably more like 32 ounces of silver for I just pulled that number out, but it was far less in value than the gold. And so one could see that instead of being 16 ounces per 1 ounce of gold, then it was like 30 ounces of silver for 1 ounce of gold. And so you had this inflationary problem. Another problem that uh, existed at the time was something called patronage. And what that was is if your party was able to get a president elected, then while that president was in office, that person basically gives all of the government jobs to the people in their own party. And it was a big thing where you would, right? So Cleveland, he tried to stop that. Like instead of just giving jobs to people in your own party, he tried to have people who are actually qualified for the job to get the job, like FEMA chair. They didn't have FEMA back then, but people who are in control of the various agencies in government, he would give them to cronies, people in his party, irregardless of whether they had qualifications or not. And Cleveland tried to reform that, but he made a lot of enemies as a result. Another problem that he had was the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR. And the issue was veterans benefits. And so this was still post-Civil War, 20 years after the Civil War. And a lot of veterans wanted to get benefits. But uh, Cleveland was like, well, let's make sure that you even saw combat or that your wounds are actually from the war. And because he was nitpicking like that, he made a lot of enemies. In other words, if you got injured after the war because you fell off your porch drunk and you broke your leg, well, we're not going to cover that, right? Because it's not a war injury, for example. And so he tried to make sure that the people who were applying for veterans benefits were actually veterans. But because he did that, and there were a lot of people who were veterans, right? Because the Civil War was still, fresh in everyone's minds. There were a lot of surviving veterans, and so they all voted against Grover Cleveland in 1888, right? And so this became an issue later. Uh, he also wanted to cut tariffs, right? Grover Cleveland did, because the tariffs were generating a lot of money so that they had a surplus in their budget. I mean, imagine that, right? The government revenue from taxation was a lot higher than what the government was spending. So Grover Cleveland wanted to reduce the tariff, right? But by reducing tariff, it would make domestic industry more vulnerable, and right, because the tariffs would make import goods cheaper than the stuff that was being sold in America, and so no one would buy the American-made stuff. And so therefore farmers and various manufacturers, they would go out of business. And so Grover Cleveland, imagine a Democrat who wanted to reduce tariffs, right? Uh, because he said the country didn't need the money. The government did not need the money. And so his enemies who wanted to keep the revenue really high, they accused Cleveland of being pro-free market, which actually was true. Anti-protectionist, okay, uh, because he wanted to reduce the tariff. Right? Isn't that kind of crazy? And at the time, to be pro-free market was kind of a dirty word. Remember, it's the Gilded Age. And so free market capitalism, getting rich, it's the time of the robber barons, right? John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and because they were getting rich and a lot of people misunderstood that wealth, right? Then Grover Cleveland declined in popularity. And so the tariff issue became an issue for him in 1888. Another second issue as to why he lost the election in 1888. He lost to Benjamin Harrison. All right, so you can kind of see that Grover Cleveland tried to control government. He tried to, at least control some of the corruption because it was rolling pretty hard now in the direction of even more corruption. Well, Grover Cleveland lost the 1888 election to Benjamin Harrison, who ends up being the 23rd president of the United States, who is also the grandson of William Henry Harrison, who was the ninth president of the United States. And so his victory over Cleveland was a little controversial, which I thought was interesting. He lost in the popular vote, but he had more electoral votes, right? Sound familiar? I think it was Clinton, right? Right, who had more popular votes, right, but lost in the electoral count. So under Harrison, right, this is now Cleveland is out of office, and under Harrison, right, all of the stops, all the things that Cleveland tried to implement to slow down the corruption in Washington, D.C., it went crazy under Harrison. Harrison was Republican. The Republicans won Congress as well. And so the president and Congress being in the same party, they just went to town on spending. So under him, what they try to do is instead of, saving the excess revenue from the tariffs, for a rainy day so that they can lower taxation, what they did was they tried to spend all the money that they had gathered and received from all of the high tariffs. Okay. And that way, if they spent all the money, it would justify keeping the tariffs high or even making them higher. And so most of this money that was, and $1 billion back in the day, right? And so they became known as the $1 billion Congress. Like they spent $1 billion. Oh my gosh. And back, I mean, we're living in a world of $36 trillion debt, right? And that's not including the unrealized, uh, what do you call it? Unfunded liabilities of the government, which puts it at more like 250 trillion. But that's for another story. But anyway, so the $1 billion, that was like out of control, mad spending. And they spent it all. And most of it went to the Grand Army of the Republic, right? And they gave full pension to anyone who could prove they were a Union soldier. And now, at this time, 20 years after the war, they couldn't work, right? And so, as long as you were a soldier for at least 90 days, right? I mean, is training even that long? I don't know. So, for 90 days, you were a Union soldier. Okay, you qualify, and you couldn't work anymore. Then you qualified for a full pension. Right. And this idea of not being able to work, you could just say, oh, I have a bad back. Do you have a real bad back? No, not really, but you'll just say you have a bad back, you can't work, and now you get a full pension. And so the number of people receiving full pensions doubled. And so therefore the associated costs, right, prices throughout society, they started going up because now you have all these people who have more cash now, and they're going to go out in the market and spend it. And by spending it, the prices all rise. Sherman Antitrust Act was passed under Benjamin Harrison, and we all know that that antitrust is actually pro-trust, right? So they broke up certain companies so that rival companies could then enter the market and actually start selling some stuff, right? And eventually it leads to the creation of monopolies, right? Because people like John D. Rockefeller were not monopolies. Anyone was allowed to try to compete against them. The reality was that he was so good and so efficient that no one could compete with his low prices, right? He wasn't raising the prices, they were lower and they kept going lower. Um, so then also under Benjamin Harrison, tariffs were raised, right? They weren't lowered, they were raised. And they were able to pull that off because they made a deal with the farmers in the Midwest. Um, you know, they said, hey, if we pass higher tariffs, then you'll be able right to farmers, you'll be able to raise the prices of the crops that you're selling. But of course, that's not what happened because tariffs were raised. All of the prices of foreign goods, especially goods that I guess were necessary for farming, they went up, but they could not sell more of their crops, right? And I think it has probably had more to do with a glut of the crops, right? They were growing too much, and so they couldn't unload it, right? Because if the United States is imposing high tariffs, then the food, the grain that's raised in the United States would probably suffer high tariffs going to other countries. And so they couldn't unload it. And so, as a result, that deal that they made to raise the tariffs benefited people in Washington in governments, but it didn't benefit the farmers. And so the farmers revolted. It was a populist revolt. And that's how Grover Cleveland got reelected after Benjamin Harrison. Okay. And that's what made him a non-consecutive two-term president. And so the economic turmoil is reminiscent. It's almost like, yeah, this is a pattern, right? You have inflation, so there's a lot of money or currency in the system, which then results in higher prices, right? On top of all of the protectionist policies that the country has. And the government is spending big. I mean, $1 billion was unheard of at that time, especially since there wasn't even a war on, right? There was no war, and they were spending so much money. And it kind of sounds a lot like today. And so the big spending government phenomena is not a recent phenomena, right? It didn't start to happen in 1971 when the United States came off the gold standard. No, no, no. It happened much, much earlier, at least, right? At the very least, it started around before Grover Cleveland and just exploded under Benjamin Harrison. We can see that wars are a big problem, right? Because of wars, then you had all this big spending, new special interest groups that form as a result, right? In this case, the veterans. And so ending wars would be a way to enable reform, right? Because wars are what's generating a lot of these bad ideas, opportunity for government to overspend, right? And so we want to end wars, but the government, right, the deep state, they want to perpetuate wars and increase the number of wars. Uh, Recently, you may have heard that Trump had ordered that there be a freeze on all the money going overseas, right? Just so for 90 days, so that the government can audit it, right, to figure out where all the money is going. But a lot of people in Ukraine are defying that order, right? They're like, we'll have an exemption, and so the money will continue to flow, so we don't have to stop. And Rubio is trying to get them to stop, but, does he have the teeth to be able to do the job that is required of him? At the same time, so you got this peace initiative by just simply cutting off the flow of money to Ukraine. At the same time, you got Trump saying that Egypt and Jordan should welcome all the Palestinian refugees, which is kind of like him saying, yeah, Israel's going to take all that land, right? Huh? Wait, no. Why does he do that? Why does he, you know, side with ending the war in Ukraine, but then sort of takes the opposite side and says, yeah, the pro-war side should win. Yeah, it's a kind of a double standard, obviously. And he's saying, oh, but look at Gaza, it's all blown up. No one can live there anyway. So why don't you go live in Egypt or Lebanon or Jordan? But of course, he says, and then we'll rebuild it and it'll be beachfront property for Jews or Israelis who want to live there. So it's kind of like a weird, sort of hypocritical, unjust, never going to work proposal from Trump. And what gets me is that he sees the devastation in North Carolina and LA, right? North Carolina because of the hurricane and LA because of the fires, but he can't recognize the devastation and even the corruption and the evil that happened in Gaza. And so that's kind of interesting, right? How, he'll see certain things accurately in one way, and then in another situation where it's not that different, he takes a different position, right? And that's the unfortunate thing of politics, right? Where it's very difficult to be consistent. And if you did try to be consistent, then you're going to make a lot of enemies. And Trump, at this point, he wants to make a lot of friends. And so it seems like that it's not in the cards. Although, keeping in mind, of course, yes, he has done a lot, but that is how massive and pervasive the corruption in DC is that he hasn't even begun to slash what he needs to slash. One final thing, the portion that we read today was a debate on imperialism. So the Spanish-American War began and ended in 1898, and at the end of it, the United States possessed the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, as well as some other formerly Spanish islands. And so all of the people in America, or many people in America, were outraged that the United States would hold on to these lands. In other words, deny the indigenous people their freedom, right? When the United States fought for freedom and then cherished their freedom. And so there was a debate over imperialism. Should America continue to be imperialistic, controlling foreign lands? Now, when I was a child here in America, the debate continued, right? We were still having this debate, except the way that it was expressed was, should the United States be the policeman of the world? Well, there's no debate any longer because the answer is yes. So basically, people have, or the State Department anyway, has decided that yes, the United States will be the policeman of the world. And so students don't even study it anymore, right? It's not debated, right? And so it's just, yeah, America, they were outraged by the imperialism. And it just stops, right? Uh, and unless you have a teacher like me, then you're not going to have that finer point emphasized, which is basically, yeah, we're having imperialism, right? And it's not in your face imperialism, at least it wasn't until Trump was reelected. But it was a different kind of imperialism where they control other places. And now Trump, because of the mercantilist mentality, is trying to take over Canada and Greenland, right? Uh, so the point of this episode is that a lot of the issues that we are seeing now didn't just recently start, right? But that the military industrial complex definitely was full blown at the end of World War II. But the whole imperialism discussion started way before that. The economic turmoil and just the government overspending started even much sooner. And the billion-dollar Congress, if we take that, certainly not as the starting point, but a significant reference point, then you can see that big spending Congress has become the norm, but it started back in the 1880s. So the questions I have to ask at the end of this episode is, have we reached peak war? Have we reached peak spending yet? Right? It'd be nice if everything started to come down. And I saw an X post from Vivek Ramaswamy how they're going to cut spending, and maybe they can pull it off. I don't know. But we have to just wait and see. So hopefully, I'm hopeful that Trump will do something positive, something good. And just the number of things he keeps doing every day, it's so many things. It it's hard to keep up, especially if you've been doing midterm grades all day, right? It's kind of hard to catch up with the current events. But he is at least, at the very least, impressing me with all of these reforms and how he and his team had come up with loopholes to get around to get rid of people from the Department of Justice, for example. So I hope that peak war and spending is in our past, that Donald Trump will change his positions on Israel, right? And he'll do that naturally by having more and more information, and then he'll realize, oh, He can't do that. He can't recognize the firestorm that was in LA and then ignore all of the destruction in Gaza. Hopefully he'll come to that aha moment. And if he can get there and somehow the economy can right itself, then we can know peace and harmony again, right? Instead of trying to figure out who we're supposed to kill next, people engage in free trade, right? Do commerce with each other. And so it no longer is an issue, and we'll know peace and prosperity again. That's it for this episode. I will talk to you guys next time.